Okay, and I want to start off by welcoming everybody. Firstly and foremostly, Patricia, for so generously giving us the honor of having the chance to speak to you about your lovely new novel, Hollyland. And there's another one coming up very soon. So this is the latest one that has come out, but very soon there's something else. And oh, there it is, the location shoot. Well, that's lovely. Lovely to meet you. Location shoot. And we can't wait to have another book club on it as well. So I hope everybody's ready. This is going to be an extraordinary literary journey with Patricia. And we're hoping that this session will transport you to the captivating world of Hollyland. So again, this is an exclusive event where you'll all have the unique opportunity to meet Patricia if you haven't met her before. Connect with also fellow enthusiasts and fans and delve into the pages of this sensational novel. And I must say, it made me cry several times. I mean, I cry at movies, but not really with novels. Although I don't know why, although it's supposed to be the opposite effect, but there were so many scenes that were particularly moving here. And it's just so full of love. I mean, I love how I keep seeing the sentence, I love you from the bottom of my heart. I love you with all my heart. I love you so much. I mean, there's so much love in it, and it's expressed differently each time it is said. So we're going to be talking about that, of course, love, magic, fame, you name it, we will discuss it. And we want to talk about how Hollyland is more than just a book. It's an exploration of love and life and the world where imagination is kind of dances hand in hand with reality. An extraordinary life, as Rye says in the beginning and at the end of the novel. So, Patricia, I will be introducing you one last time. Patricia Leavy is a sociologist, a best-selling author, and arts advocate. Many of you know Patricia from her novels, and others know her very well from the Handbook of Arts-Based Research and Method Meets Art, and so many others. She has published over 40 books, earning commercial and critical success in both nonfiction and fiction, and her work has been translated into many languages. Her works have garnered many book awards, including USA Best Book Awards, Independent Press Awards, International Impact Book Awards, National Indie Excellence Awards, Firebird Book Awards, International Book Awards, New York City Big Book Awards, and American Fiction Awards. Most recently, her novel Hollyland received a Literary Titan Book Award for fiction. She has also received career awards from the New England Sociological Association, the American Creativity Association, the American Educational Research Association, the International Congress of Qualitative Inquiry, and the National Art Education Association. In 2018, she was honored by the National Women's Hall of Fame, and SUNY New Paltz established the Patricia Leavy Award for Art and Social Justice. We are so honored and happy to have you with us today, Patricia. So I don't know if anybody else would like to start with the first question here, but if you have a question, please use the virtual hand button so that we'll be able to see you. If you raise the physical hand on camera, we might see you if you're on our front page, but we also might miss you if you aren't on our front page. So the virtual hand, I guess, is the one that is the easiest one to spot. I might
I just
start
want to
by
say thank you. Thank you for those incredibly, incredibly kind words about the book and the embarrassing bio about me. Thank you. And thank you for having me here. And thank you for everybody who's choosing to spend your time here. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to chatting with everyone. And I'll start wherever, whatever question you have, Rula, but you commented on a lot of love being in this book, and it's true. And I would love a chance to tell you why I wrote the book and when I wrote it, but we can start somewhere else if you prefer.
That's an amazing place to start because this is actually where I wanted to begin by asking you why and how Hollyland.
So if you've read some of my previous novels, they are not all filled with love and affection, which is why when you mentioned that, I wanted to sort of say when I wrote it and why I wrote it. I wrote this during the lockdown. So I wrote it during the pandemic. I wrote it during a time when we were completely isolated from one another. Couldn't see friends, family. I'm sure we were all living in pretty much the same sort of experience at that time. And I wrote it when human beings were afraid to be 6 feet from one another, literally having existential fear that you could kill your friend or neighbor or loved one. So I wrote it at a time when we were all missing human affection in a very real way, missing hugs and handshakes and kisses on cheeks and just spending time not on Zoom but in person with other human beings. So I'm sure I was feeling what many others were feeling. I was feeling, isolated and lonely and afraid and bored. And I was, double fisting potato chips like a lot of other people, and binge watching like all guilty pleasure things and doing the things that a lot of us, I think, were doing to just try and emotionally and mentally get through the lockdown. And so ultimately, the thing that I always turn to is creativity. And that is just like my personal saving grace. And so I wrote during the lockdown. I actually wrote 4 books from start to finish, which I like usually takes a lot longer for me to write a book. But I was writing 7 days a week and I was doing nothing else because there was literally nothing else to do. So for 7 days a week during our lockdown period, which was very extensive, I wrote. And Hollyland was the second book I wrote during that period. And I wrote it for a couple of reasons. I mean, first of all, as I said, we were all completely isolated and in a world without affection. And so I decided mentally, I wanted to be in a world filled with affection, filled with love, filled with unambiguous love. There are no toxic relationships. There's no, is this love? Is filled with all different kinds of love. And that is romantic love. So the main story between Dee and Rye is a romantic love story, but it's other kinds of loves too. It's love that Dee has for her father, love that Dee has for her mother who died when she was a little girl, love that she has for the arts and creativity, for her close friends, and the love that all the other characters have for those kinds of people and things as well. So I wanted to write a book that was sort of very sweet and affectionate and warm and sort of would make me feel like the book was like wrapping me in a hug because I felt that's what I needed. And I always feel if you feel you need something, you're probably not the only one, and maybe other people are feeling that way too. So I got the idea that I was going to write some sort of love story. And as I got this idea, my elderly father, with whom I am extremely close, came down with COVID. And this is before the vaccine. This is, when a lot of elderly people were dying from COVID, and he had pre-existing health conditions. He had cancer. He's very overweight. And I was terrified at the time that this was a death sentence, and I didn't know if I'd ever see him again. And he is my number one person. So he and my daughter, they're my number one people, forever. So I was terrified never see him again. I live in the US, in Maine, up north. He and my mother live in Florida, down in the South. There was no way to get to them. This was during the lockdown. And even if I could have gotten there, I wouldn't have been able to see him because you couldn't see people with COVID at that time. So in short, I could not go and see him. And I didn't know if I'd ever get to see him again. So I decided I was going to write him a letter telling him how much I love him and everything that he means to me. And so I sat down to write what I thought would be a letter to my father. And I started writing what became Hollyland. And I realized right away that, well, first of all, maybe I'm not very good at writing letters. I'm not sure. That's not something I normally do, but I do know how to write a novel. And I also felt like there is no letter that would fully express all the things I wanted to express. And as someone who expresses herself through metaphor and symbolism and in artistic and poetic ways, and not always just in literal ways, I thought that I would do it through the book. So I do want to be clear, the book is fictional because I've published over a dozen novels, and I'm accused of being every single protagonist, which is sort of amazing because they're all radically different from each other. And so it literally would be impossible. There are seeds of me in all my characters and all my books because everything we write and create artistically comes through our filter, but that does not mean it is autobiographical. And this book is not autobiographical. However, the relationship between Dee and her father, Lou, is very much based on my relationship with my father. And so while this is a love story between Dee, who's an arts researcher and writer, and Rye, who's a Hollywood movie star, it's also a love story between Dee and her father. And for me, mentally, that was actually my starting point. And Lou is fictional, but I did take things from my father's history, his family's history, his life, and our relationship, and I whipped them up with some imagination and sprinkled them throughout the book. He's the only person who will ever know every single nod to him and his family, but they are in the book. From him being from Brooklyn, from some things about the way he grew up and the kind of family he grew up in, to where he lives now, to details about things we would do when I was a kid, and we go out to breakfast and the things we would eat, the different foods throughout the entire book, or basically my father's favorite foods. Then there are small things like names. The name Lou, he had two uncles. They were both named Lou. They were his favorite uncles. There's a character, Seymour Peretz, in the novel, who is a big Hollywood movie studio executive. And Peretz is a family name in my father's family. And I could just go on with the little sort of nods. But the much bigger nod to my father is that my father is the most optimistic person I have ever met in my life. This is not a quality I share, or at least not in the way that he does. For him, I think it's natural. For me, it's something I have to work at a bit more. But he is the most optimistic person. The glass is half full, the glass is overflowing. Something terrible happened. No, let's look at it this way. He is that kind of person. And he is definitely a person who believes in like making the most of your life and making your own luck in life, and following your bliss. And so really, I decided that that's what this book would be about. This would be an optimistic book about looking at life and love with hopeful eyes, and what might come from that. And so that was really the impetus for the book. And I wanted to write it quickly because I mean, I honestly, I was afraid that my father was going to die. And so I wanted to write it quickly, and I do have the experience that I can write something quickly when I want to. So I worked on it 24 hours a day, but I decided, you want to write this quickly, draw on what you know. What I know about the most is the arts. What I love the most is the arts. So Dee, the main character, became an arts researcher, which obviously I can relate to, and a writer. And she is surrounded by artists in the entertainment industry. And there is a very strong narrative, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, about the arts sprinkled in throughout the book. I mean, like, at least I would say, if you literally go through the words in the book, probably half the book is about the arts, just under the guise of like a sexy beach read. So it is a romance and a love story, but there is this very persistent narrative about the arts and making art, the magic to be found in making art, the courage it takes to make art, what the arts bring to our lives, the difference between famous art and art that isn't. Is there a difference? What is that difference? All these different kinds of things. And so I wrote the book very quickly. I sent it to my copy editor because I didn't want to send my dad crap. And I was afraid if it was the last thing he ever read that I wrote, that I didn't want it to be bad. So I sent it to my copy editor. She copy edited it quickly. I overnighted it to my dad. He read it. He loved it. He saw all the nods to his life that many others would never see. He completely loved it. And fast forward, the book was published 2 years after that. And I did revise it many times in between and take it to my writing group and do all the things that I hadn't initially done. So it was revised. It was put out over 2 years later. My dad is alive and well and has read many more of my books, The Location Shoot, and some others that aren't even heading to be published quite yet. So that is how this book sort of came to be. And that's why I love, Rula, that you said it was just so filled with love. But that is why. It's because it was for my dad, and because it was at a time when I felt like we all need a lot of love. And so I'm sure there are some readers who will be like, oh, it's too sweet or it's too sappy. But I will make no apologies for putting love into the world. And I've put some things out, some books that aren't like that. And so I know what it is like to put out something that's gritty in a way, but this is not what this book is. This book is about like living and loving with passion and searching for magic, or what Dee calls gold dust, and knowing that if you believe and you live fully in the moment, that that gold dust might be right around the corner.
That's an amazing story. And you could so feel that when reading it. I mean, there are so many love stories out there, but this is different. I mean, they never fight. Nothing bad ever happens. It is so optimistic all the way through, except for that part when something happens to D. I don't know how much we can give away from the plot. Maybe we can. I don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't read it yet, but when trouble happens with Dee towards the end, I mean, that's when the real tension happens. And then before that, there were those little surprises when they were discovering bits and pieces about each other all throughout. And of course, there's so much about the arts, and also we'll get to that in a bit. But the love is so pure. It's beautiful. It's
Thank you.
instantaneous. It stays all throughout the novel until the very end. And it's just, it's unlike any other love story that you read where the plot is around, somebody cheated on somebody else, or I don't know what. I mean, you'd expect a paparazzi story where, they might put Rye in a bad situation that he's cheating on Dee, but that never really happens.
Yep.
Love is
And
sustained all
I did leave
throughout.
little bird seeds, like I know how readers think. And I also know that we're conditioned to be cynical in a lot of ways. Like, oh, that's too good to be true. Like, my father would never look at anything in life like that. Like, if something seemed really good, he would believe that's really good. And then,
Good.
you know what? Most of the time it would be. And so it's just a different way to look at life. And I really wanted it to come through from the beginning to the end, which is one of the reasons. So Dee is 40 years old, Rye is 50 years old and divorced. These are people who have lived a little. Most romance novels, or novels that are called romance novels, the characters are in their 20s, sometimes they're in their
Yeah.
30s. And I do think that in the different seasons of our life, we hopefully approach relationships differently. And if you get it right when you're young, that's fantastic. I definitely didn't. And a lot of what happens when we're young in relationships is because we don't necessarily have the self-esteem, the confidence, our own sense of identity yet. We don't necessarily have tools to cope with conflict or differences. And hopefully we develop more of those things through the life course. And so I did decide for them to have this sort of deep and instant love, and for it to be real and sustaining. I did feel that making them older and making this not their first serious relationship, which there's so many books about first loves, and that's great. I love those books, but this is not what that is. These are people who were like ready. Like, if they found the right person, they knew what to do with it. And you also, this doesn't give anything away for those who haven't read it yet, but you also find out right in the second chapter, I think, that they both lost their mothers when they were young.
Mhm.
So Rye's parents were both very famous actors, and his mother was murdered by a fan when he was a little boy, and it was like splashed all over the media and the tabloids. And as you can imagine, it's given him sort of a negative relationship with the paparazzi, which, as a famous actor himself, that has been challenging. And Dee's mother died of cancer when she was a little girl. And she looked at her like she was magical, as Rye looked at his mother like, they were magical. And when you lose someone at a young age, I think they become frozen to you in a way, in your memory, the way a child sees someone. So like, almost like, like a fairy godmother kind of person. So they are bonded by the fact that they both are extremely passionate about the arts, but they come from it in very different ways. she's like very learned and academic and shy. And he is like out there in your face, you know, black leather pants, tight shirt, Hollywood actor kind of thing. But they both love the arts and entertainment. And they both have lived with this tremendous grief. And I think the loss of a mother or any parent at a young age is something that you can't understand unless you've experienced it. And so it just bonds them quickly and deeply. So one of the ways that, just thinking about it as a writer, like how do you create a story, which this is always my tip for anyone who might aspire to do creative writing or already does creative writing. One of the things I always think about is you want people to accept your story world. You want them to accept your characters. And it might be very different from what they're used to. I mean, most people's relationship experiences do have negative aspects that this relationship doesn't. So how do you draw people in and get readers to hopefully at least be on board with that? This is who these people are, and like I can go along for that ride. And so I think finding things in this case that would truly be bonding for people in a meaningful way, and making them a little older than what you traditionally find in romance novels. So, you know, this isn't their first shot. This is the shot where they're going to get it right. Like this is the time where they've learned from their past mistakes. And in this relationship, they're going to try and get it right. And even the, you know, the big event that you mentioned, which, I mean, I can say this, it's even in the back cover synopsis, is that Dee mysteriously disappears at one point. And so there's a question like, is history repeating? Did something happen to her as had happened to Rye's mother? Is it that kind of, is this going to be you know, a sad ending to this Hollywood story? But really, in any of my books, if there is a kidnapping or a car accident or any sort of big event, the book is never about that event, ever. That event is always just a plot device to push the characters to reflect on themselves and their relationships. It's always about character development, always. So in the case of this book, I mean, you know, Rula mentioned this event happens pretty late in the book, and it's actually resolved pretty quickly. And the reason is because I only use this event to reinforce who Dee and Rye are to each other and what their relationship is. So, and I totally love books with like big, crazy plots. So I get that if you're a fan of that. I read books like that, but that's not what I'm interested in writing. I think the one thing that all my novels have in common, even though they're in different genres and they have a different sort of emotional tenor, the thing they all have in common is that they're about relationships. They are about love. They are about relationships, and they are about learning about yourself. They're about self-discovery. So any sort of big events that happen are just so the characters can have like be prompted for more self-discovery and reinforcing whatever their relationship is. In this book, it's positive. In some books, it's not positive. But the events only happen because, as we know from life, we often can get sort of, you know, you get into habits and routines and patterns, and sometimes it's a big event happening. You have a health scare, someone you love has a health scare, there's trouble in your place of employment, there's some global issue that's happening or local issue that's troublesome. Those kinds of things are often the catalyst for people making decisions about their lives. And so changing something, taking something to heart instead of taking it for granted, whatever it might be. So in Hollyland and really in all of my novels, any sort of like big event, it's all just to promote self-discovery in the characters, which I ultimately then hope is, you know, what lives on in readers. And I
Such
will
a
tell
strong
you,
point.
I did have one reader message me on Facebook. I've never met this woman before. But she did tell me, and it's not the first time someone's told me this about one of my novels. She said, you know, that she's going to try and treat her husband differently and treat people in her life differently after reading this. I had a reader years ago for a different novel email me and say, you know, I don't know if I know any people this kind. And so I said, the question is, are you that kind? I mean, that's the question. So it's always about, you know, all characters in all books, they can be role models, they can be aspirational, they can be cautionary tales, but they are mirrors that we can reflect our own lives against. They are yardsticks by which to measure yourself. So, you know, if Dee and Rye teach you nothing else but different ways to say I love you to each other, I think that's awesome.
Oh, it is, absolutely. And the fact that they're not in that usual stereotypical romance novel age group, that was just amazing. And they both were looking for an extraordinary life. This is something that they repeated more than once in the novel. This extraordinary life. And they found it, or it found them, I don't know, but they trusted this magic, this instinct, the gut feeling that, as you said, they're probably now they know what to do with it. And they did well after so many mishaps and things that have happened in their
And that's one of the
previous
things
lives.
too, like I do write in a lot of my novels, like people are searching for a big life or an extraordinary life or a magical life. They're always searching for something like that or trying to create something like that. And part of it is to like raise questions like, what is an extraordinary life? Because I actually think that that's what most people want in some way, to have some kind of life that does not feel ordinary or dull. And I think that, and people make that to be many different things. And for a lot of people, that can be something very simple. I mean, that, and these can be like very attainable things. You know, some people want to have children, and that's an extraordinary life to them, to be at home raising their family. There's many different things that could constitute what that is, but I think that it's a very human thing. And so in this case, like Rye is, Rye has over $100 million. He's a famous movie star. He has what many people would think of as an extraordinary life. But really, I don't think he has that extraordinary life until he's sharing his life with someone, and someone who actually doesn't care about fame and money at all. And that's a Dee. Just having real human connection, that becomes what is their extraordinary life. I mean, one of my favorite scenes, actually, like one of my two favorite scenes for sure in the novel, is the gift he gives her at the wedding.
Yeah.
That I cried when I was writing that. And then
That was my tearjerker.
I did what all novelists do when I was sitting crying, writing it. I was whispering to myself, this is so good. But yeah, literally. But I cried when I wrote that, but which I can read to you if you want. I can read an excerpt for people who haven't.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So Ryan D fall in love. They if you haven't read the book, they meet outside a bar one night. So this happens on page 1, is their like meet cute scene. Dee goes outside to take a cell phone call, and Rye comes out the back door of this bar to smoke a cigarette. And her phone call is very provocative, which I'm not going to share because I was very proud of that scene. I think it's wickedly funny. It's a little dirty, y'all, but I think it's very funny. And so when she's done with this phone call, which she's mortified having in front of him, he stops to ask her what the call was about. And they have an instant connection and end up going to his house that night. They get takeout burgers and sort of sharing their life story. And they bond over the loss of their mothers, which they talk about on that first night. And she says during that conversation that she can't remember her mother's voice. And how sad that makes her, that for all the memories she has of her mother, she lost her mother's voice. So, okay, now I just need a second to find it. I did mark some things, but let's see if okay. So they're having their wedding at Seymour Peretz's house. Seymour Peretz is the head of a huge Hollywood movie studio. He's literally the most powerful person in Hollywood. And he grew up in Brooklyn with Lou, Dee's father. So Dee has known him her whole life. And she wanted to have the wedding at their house because it was a place that her mother had been. And she wanted the wedding to be someplace where her mother had been, just to give you a sense of how much her mother and the loss of her mother meant to her, which obviously Ryan understands because he lost his mother too. So this is one of my two favorite scenes in the book. Sweetheart, I got you a wedding present. Come into the house so I can give it to you in private. He took her hand and they walked inside. I got you a little something too. Let me run upstairs to get it, she said. He waited at the bottom of the staircase, and when she returned, he led her to Seymour's home screening room. He held both of her hands in his. You told me that you lost your mother's voice. I spoke to your father, and it turns out that Seymour, being the film enthusiast he is, made home movies of your parents on a camcorder when you were a little girl. Your father said you used to run away from the camera because you were so shy, so that's probably why you don't remember. Seymour went digging through his warehouse. He stopped and kissed her hand. Sweetheart, he found the videos. We had them transferred onto a disc. I gave your father a copy too. Her eyes became misty, her lips quivering. He squeezed her hands and said, just sit here. She sat down a bit stunned, and he darted to the back of the room. He turned the lights off, hit play, and took the seat beside her, handing her a preemptive tissue. Suddenly, Lizette Schwartz was on the screen, talking and laughing, as radiant as a movie star. Oh my God, he gasped, as her eyes flooded with hot tears. A moment later, Lizette twirled little Dee around. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old. Dee tried to run behind her mother, shy in front of the camera. Lizette laughed and said, my sweet little Deanna. She scooped her up in her arms. I love you, sweet girl. See, I even cry now reading it. When the video ended, Dee looked at Rye through a film of hot tears. He gently brushed away the salty water and pressed his forehead to hers. When she was able to speak again, she softly said, you gave me my mother's voice. Seymour helped, he replied. You gave me my mother's voice. I love you more than I could ever say. So that's one of my favorite scenes in the book, which I think expresses the love that really you mentioned is, I hope, permeating the book. And also this idea of, you know, who are the real movie stars in our life? And so I did make this guy a movie star. They are in Hollywood, surrounded by movie stars. There are a bunch of movie stars at their wedding. But really, in each of our lives, on the big screen of our lives, who are the real movie stars? And I partly did it sort of as, for me, as an antidote to the world we live in of pop culture obsession, celebrity obsession, Instagram perfect photos. Like, does anybody ever like share a photo online that they haven't edited or taken 100 shots of? Like, this is the world we live in. Like, that's the world my 23-year-old daughter, it's the only world she's ever known, is where you spend your life having Instagram moments instead of just making memories. And I'm not even critiquing it. It's just the reality. This is the world we live in, for better or worse. And I think in that world, if you look at the millions and millions of followers that celebrities have on Instagram, you can see that we're basically a celebrity obsessed culture. Because otherwise, why are we following all these people we don't know? And do we really care what, you know, Julia Roberts ate for breakfast today, or whoever, or whatever it might be? But yet we follow these people in droves. We sell magazines that are basically devoted to following them around and taking photos of them in their leisure time. And so I wanted to write something that would get people thinking about, as I was, because I was afraid my father was dying of a disease that we didn't understand, who are actually the movie stars in our life. And so that's part of what this scene was meant to convey. But that's one of my favorite little moments to share.
Mine too, actually. That was the most touching part of the novel for me, and also the ending, you know, when the big surprise.
Thank you. I love the ending, and I don't write my books in order. I write them as scenes and I stick them together
Uh-huh.
later on. So
Hmm.
like the first chapters I wrote in this book, or I think like chapters 6 and 7, they're a restaurant scene that happens
Hmm.
towards the end of the first third of the book. I write out of order, but I knew the last words. I usually know the last words the minute I start, but the last words of this book, which that I will not share because I don't want to spoil it for anyone.
Yeah.
But the last words of this book are maybe my favorite last words of any book I've written. I just feel like it's a very hopeful thing to leave readers with. And I know as someone who reads a lot of books and novels myself that, you know, you're left with the last words, like, and those
Mm-hmm.
reverberate in your head.
Absolutely.
And I really
Yes.
wanted to leave
Mhm.
people with something that I thought would, writing that chapter made me teary too, though. Writing this chapter,
Mhm.
writing that chapter, I cried a lot, but it's like happy tears because these are happy events.
Right.
I've
Because they're
sat and
very
cried writing
moving.
things that aren't
Yeah.
happy. But yeah.
Well, speaking of the restaurant scenes, besides Dee being a famous researcher and a best-selling novelist, I mean, those are some seeds of Patricia in Dee. But does Dee eat like you? I don't know.
I don't know if she does. Okay, so obviously I have a
Because
reputation for like
the
crazy
food
eating,
is just
but
wow. I mean,
this is because in my books I have all this amazing food, and then Rula follows me on Instagram, and I'm constantly posting like what I ate for dinner. And like, but it's like if I have something really good, I feel the need to share this with people, which totally corroborates my earlier point that we are obsessed with Instagram and social media, many of us. Um, so yeah, there's some good food in the book, but a lot of the food was inspired by things my dad likes to eat. So I sprinkled those things
right.
throughout the book. From their very first meal together is like a burger and fries takeout, because I think if my father had to pick a last meal, that would definitely be on the list of contenders.
Mhm.
So yeah. But that restaurant scene was actually the first scene I wrote. It's a
Mhm.
scene, if you haven't read the book, to me, it was the pivotal scene in the book. It happens like a third of the way in, but it was like pivotal for what in my mind, for what this book was going to be. And it's the scene I've received the most comments on. The reviewers who love the book, they talk about that scene. People who don't like the book, they talk about that scene. So it's become a lightning rod, which I honestly, I'm not totally sure why. I had great fun writing it. Um, but it's a scene where Rye and Dee are dating, and he is supposed to go to dinner with a director that he and a couple actor friends want to get to direct a film they're going to do. And this director, Oliver Spence, he's like the hot director right now. He's a British director. He does a lot of like critically acclaimed indie kind of films. And Rye and these two male actors that he has a script with really want to get him on board on this project. And they're both going with their wives, and Ryan invites Dee to be his date. And at this point, he knows she's a writer and an arts researcher, but he does not know how well known her work is and how successful she is. And she's extremely humble, so she would never say anything like that to anyone. So sure enough, they're trying to woo this director, and he has like no interest in any of the stars, but he knows who Dee is immediately, and his like mind is blown, and he literally is like, holy shit, I've never met an actual legend before. And so these famous movie stars are like looking on like, what are you talking about? But it's because he's really interested in art and making good art and quality art. He doesn't care about Hollywood. He's not into that. He's interested really in making great art and what his legacy will be as an artist. And this is what she writes about and researches and promotes around the world. So he wants to spend the night basically talking with her. And other people come into the scene, takes place over two chapters. First, they're in the bar, then they're in the dining room of the restaurant. Other people come into it. This is where you're introduced to Seymour Peretz, the Hollywood executive. There are a couple of hip hop artists that come in, and there's a big conversation about the relationship between art and science that happens with these hip hop artists. I don't want to give everything away in these two chapters, but this is an evening this is Dee's night, basically. She doesn't want it to be that way. She's embarrassed by it. She's shy. She's quiet. She just wants to sit quietly as Rye's date and like eat her dinner. But because all these other people know her work and Oliver Spence is obsessed with the fact that she's there, she becomes the one who is basically the star and has to sell this movie to this director. And actually, one of my favorite quote in the whole book happens in that scene, which I can read you an excerpt of that too. Rula,
Mhm.
should
Mhm.
okay.
Sure.
So hold on, I have to find it. Okay. So this is a long scene. It happens over 2 chapters. One of the chapters is quite long. But this is where it's real discussion about the arts and art and education and arts integration and the relationship between art and science and whether it matters if art is commercially successful or not. And all these different things come up over the course of this evening. And Dee has opinions that are very different from the other people at the table who have all done everything they possibly could to be commercially successful. Whereas she just really wants to connect with what it means to make and experience art. And so at one point, at the end of the evening, the dinner's going to be over soon, and Oliver Spence just wants to talk to Dee more. And she says, no, these other guys are more interesting. He goes, no, just let me ask you one question. And here is that. Okay, so he says, nonsense, just tell me this. What inspired you to study arts in the unique way you have? What do you want next? I love the arts, have since I was a little girl. Sitting in a movie theater, going to a concert, reading a novel, it all just seemed magical. Who wouldn't benefit from more magic in their lives? Rye put his arm around her and she nuzzled closer to him. At some point, I realized that for all the arts bring to our lives, they aren't valued. Our education system is proof of that. I had the foolish idea that if I could explain the science of art, explore how people experience art and learn from it, that maybe we'd start to value it more. She stopped and sighed, but truthfully, it's all bullshit. Oliver looked stunned. Why do you say that? Don't misunderstand me. Everything I've researched and written is true. It's just that it shouldn't matter. We should value art for art's sake, but sometimes people can't see what's right in front of them, so you have to give them a way to see it. Oliver smirked and said, you're like the Wizard of Oz, the woman behind the curtain showing everyone the gold dust they already possess, their power. She smiled. Funny, my friend Seymour has always called me his Dorothy. Perhaps the yellow brick road was really just a trail of gold dust connecting one dream to another. That's my favorite line in the book. But that was those 2 chapters, which started out as one massive scene and became 2 chapters. That was where I started the book. So it really started for me on this narrative about the arts. And I can't even say it was intentional. I really think it was a case of write what you know. And in that moment, I needed quick inspiration. And so I went to something I know. And I will say, I am not Dee, she is not me. We do not have the same life experience. But that discussion there, that is totally me. That is absolutely me. And actually, a year ago, I was very honored to receive an Arts and Learning Award, which I accepted via Zoom. And they asked me to, say something. And instead of saying something like making a speech, I read them that. And it was before the book was published. I said, this is how I feel about this. This is my response. So that definitely represents me running across the pages of the book.
I love how it goes about the arts in a way that they speak about so much unrecognized talent. The whole falsity of fame and the real value behind it as well. And there's one sentence that I really like. I was underlining a lot of sentences here. It's on page 117 when Lou said, after figuring out that Rye did not have a university education and he was a school dropout, he says, I've always thought that a motivated person could get a graduate level education with just a library card. So I found that a very powerful statement here. And it is so arts-based research also in a way. So yeah,
I
I
love that
thought that was
sentence, so thank you.
Patricia here.
Look, you can have all the degrees in the world and you might not have learned very much at all, except learning how to do school, learning how to get through school. And you can be a person who has been very well read and studied a lot and gotten a lot that may or may not be formal education. And we also know that the same degree does not mean the same thing for 2 people. What they actually learned. I mean, getting a degree is like checking a box. Like like, but what did you learn? It's like saying both people went to the grocery store, but what did you buy? Like, did you get fish and
Yeah.
vegetables or did you get cookies and potato chips? It's, we equate it as all the same thing, but it's not. And I understand why we do that for convenience. But the reality is that there are some people who are very, very talented and very well read and very knowledgeable who might have less formal education in a certain area. And there are
Mhm.
people who have a lot of formal education, but maybe have not done as much of their own work, thought about as much of their own work. I mean, I was on an awards committee not that long ago. I was asked to be on an awards committee. I'm not going to say anything about what it was or the people, keep it all anonymous, but there were two candidates for this award. And I was blown away comparing their CVs. Like I was really, really blown away because one person had won a ton of awards. Like it looked, I had never heard of this person. So it's no knock on them. Like but it looked like their entire career was devoted to winning awards. But when I looked at their publications, there were very few publications. It was like they must, every time they have an article come out, like apply for everything, have colleagues nominate them. I mean, like, I just couldn't even make sense of it. Whereas the other person is so well published and had created so much literature in her field. I mean, you just didn't have all the awards because she probably was busy creating work and not applying for awards. Um,
Yeah.
I and I'm not critiquing people for going after awards for their work. I mean, in some of my nonfiction books, I've encouraged people to do that if you want to be recognized in your field and to move your career forward. I totally understand that. But I am a believer in doing the work first. If the work is primary. And then if it's rewarded in that way, that's lovely. And if it isn't, that doesn't mean it's not valuable. It could be very valuable. But looking at these two CVs, so like theoretically, either of these people could have been given this award. It depends how the committee would choose to view it, right? If they're impressed by all these other awards and therefore, well, this person is an award winner, so therefore we give them this. People might not think that way, word for word, but that is something that happens. There is this momentum thing that happens whereas versus actually looking at like, what is the body of work and what is the impact of that work? This other person's body of work in articles and in books, in international journals. I mean, it was just, I was blown away by the amount of work. And I was shocked by how many awards somebody else had received relative to the size and the scope of their body of work. So again, I do believe that a person can get a formal education, but not necessarily learn a lot. A person could get a formal education and learn a ton. A person could not get a formal education and still choose to educate themselves in an area. And there are different ways for doing that. And there are also some fields where really it's about practice. And so not every subject, and I mean, I'm a person who went on for a PhD. I obviously believe in education, and for me, it has served me well. But there are some fields in which getting practical experience is more important. Getting hands-on experience is more important. And so I think it's important to value that too. So in this book, Dee is highly educated. Like she has multiple degrees, including a doctorate. She got them extremely young ages. She got them in diverse fields. I mean, she studied everything, from art education to neuroscience. Like she's highly educated in a formal sense. Whereas Rye dropped out of school when he was in high school to pursue acting. But he's extremely well read and he's fascinated not only with the arts, but also with history and American history. And so he can hold a conversation with you on many topics. And I think we shouldn't discount the different ways that people learn.
Wow, that's lovely. And also, I like how, I don't know if it's a critique, but there's this slight critique or casting a little light on the shadow of academia. I mean, as an ex-academic, I see it that way. How, you mentioned things about, for example, people getting promoted, and other people just working their asses off and not getting anywhere within the academy. And then you also mentioned how, or you you kind of show us how the whole notion of awards is actually more centric around this whole aspect of not value but judgment. So awards are about judgment, not necessarily about value. And there's so much unrecognized talent, and there's so much fake fame, and there's so much of, not all that glitters is gold dust, to use Dee's term. So I like that because it's so eye-opening in many senses, because you mentioned that we live in a world of perfect Instagram photos, a world of appearances, a world of awards and stuff like that. And while it may mean so much in so many cases, it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. So
It's so
I like
true.
how you spotlighted this.
Thank you. And it's, look, it also, I think that our own life experience and perspective comes through and everything that we create or write. You couldn't help but for it to come through. And so, look, I've been publishing my work for over 25 years. I wrote a lot of things that certainly didn't get any awards or any recognition, like everybody else. I've been rejected thousands, not hundreds, thousands of times. I absolutely know what that life experience is. And I also know that the things that have gotten me the lovely recognition that you embarrassed with me earlier, I also know that those things aren't necessarily any better than the things that didn't get any recognition. And I also know that my work going forward is more likely to get recognition because I already have. And I also know that that's ridiculous. I understand that full gamut of experience. And don't get me wrong. I am, as anyone would be, I'm very, very grateful. Nobody knows that they're going to get any recognition for their work. The reality is that most people who do great work don't get any recognition for it. So I am genuinely grateful for any recognition I have ever received or that I might ever receive. But it also is something where as soon as you win an award, all of a sudden you start winning awards, because now you're an award winner. So people give you more. And there are cycles that happen. There's a very big award in my field, that I certainly think I am one of many people who, if I received it, that would be appropriate. And I think I'm one of many people that's the case for, but I took my name out of consideration years ago, and you have to consent to it. So I'll never be considered for this award because I took my name out. And the reason I did it is because there's a handful of us who are likely to get it, when I know that there are hundreds or thousands of people doing work that ought to be recognized. So, I do think it's very complicated. I found the scene that you're talking about, Rula.
Mhm.
So I do want to read a snippet of
Oh,
it, if that's
please,
okay with
yes.
everyone. This was definitely a case where Patricia Leavy was being a little bit snarky, but it's okay because I did it through fiction and through the character of Dee Schwartz, so it's not really me. But I do believe this is true. And I will also say this, I critiqued the academic award system like 20 years ago. And people said, oh, well, it's sour grapes, or it's because you don't win awards, or that. I do it now. I've won like over 50 awards, which I'm actually embarrassed about, but that is what it is. And then people say, well, she should be more grateful. Like so it's like, so what you're really saying is that we can't critique the academic award system at all, ever. And I certainly am grateful, and it is nice to have your work recognized. But that is not where the value in the work comes. And I can say that some of my favorite things I've done are not things that have necessarily been successful on a commercial level or award level, but I consider that some of my best work. And I have done some things where I am surprised, that they have received recognition, and have not always thought that that is where I would have placed that recognition. So that's just being honest about it. So I did have a little bit of fun with this scene. So as I mentioned earlier, if you haven't read the book, Dee and Rye meet outside a bar one night. She goes back to his place. They end up spending the night together. You know this all in the beginning, so I'm not spoiling anything. She had ditched two of her friends in the bar that night. She went back to tell them. But she had a female and male friend of hers, Sarah and Troy, at the bar. And she told them that she, met this guy and who he is. And she left. And so the next day, Rye is asking her if her friends were, pissed off basically that she ditched them. Okay. So let me see the right place to begin this. Okay. Okay, so she says, okay, so were they upset? No, although Sarah thought I was out of my mind. Sarah's a professor. She's a film studies professor at UCLA, and she's maybe a little uptight. No, although Sarah thought I was out of my mind to leave with you. She's kind of uptight. Well, that sounds unflattering. Cautious. She's a little cautious. Would she have been against you leaving with anyone, or should I take it personally? Dee laughed. Maybe a little of both. We met in graduate school. She's very studious, brainy. It's funny because she's a professor at UCLA, teaches film studies of all things, but she's not so keen on actors, or at least not the famous ones. Every year she gets invited to film festivals, Cannes, Venice, Berlin. She spends all her time there attending screenings, but she never goes to any of the parties. Celebrity offends her. And you? No, not at all. But to be honest, I'm not enamored by it. Fame seems a bit silly to me. Being an actor is great and I respect it, but I don't see much difference between the A-listers and the unknowns. It's about the work. She paused for a moment to consider her words. Besides, if you really think about how our culture places value, it seems to me like the most celebrated people should be the ones curing diseases, healing the sick, freeing the oppressed, teaching the young, protecting the country, and so on. Not those who are lucky enough to spend their life making art and entertainment. Our value system seems a little off. He huffed. I don't disagree with you. I don't want to give you a bad impression of Sarah. She's super smart and a loyal friend. You'd like her, I think. You just have to consider where she's coming from. Academia is a snake pit, kind of like our government. Rye laughed. Oh, you laugh, but trust me, I know. Aside from Hollywood or Washington, D.C., there's nothing more hierarchical and elitist than academia. It's kind of like high school, but with funding wars. A few people are elevated to the popular crew, a couple of whom are anointed prom king and queen, and everyone else has to pretend to be happy for them while they work their behinds off for no recognition, substandard treatment, and little pay. Sarah's always been a worker bee. She sees parallels between Hollywood and academia, that's all. Makes her suspicious of those who have made it. So I do find my ways in my fiction and in my creative work to share some of my ideas, or just for thought, like things to think about. I mean, I for a several year period was basically on a circuit with a few other people, like I can name them on the fingers on one hand, who were getting all the big awards in our field. And it was like, I know if I don't get it, like he'll get it or it was like, that it should not be that way. And as far as I'm aware, I was the only one to speak out about it. So basically I was told I was, difficult and ungrateful and be happy and, like all that sort of stuff. So again, it just proves to you there's no appropriate time to talk about this stuff. Even when you receive the recognition, you can't question the bigger cycle of lots of people doing very important work. That doesn't mean everyone in the world is working equally, but there are a lot of people doing very important, valuable, interesting work, and doing the same work and not necessarily receiving any recognition for it. So I'm aware of that and how that makes people feel, and it does impact other things. It impacts people's, job opportunities. It impacts funding. It impacts publishing contracts. It impacts a lot of material things that impact your life and your career and the opportunities available to you. So I did have a little fun. I love good like supporting cast. I love side characters because you can sort of say things through those characters that you don't necessarily have to make a running narrative throughout the book, but you can just pop those little ideas in there. So I like to have these, it's usually friends of whoever the main characters are. Sometimes it's coworkers or family members, but I like to have these characters that allow you to sort of pop these ideas and thoughts in there without making it a main narrative.
Yeah. Hmm. And I also love how Hollywood is kind of like there's this analogy between academia or academic glamour and Hollywood glamour as well. So yeah, and you sprinkle it throughout. It's wonderful. It's not just through Dee, but as you said, it's like, also through her friend. Um and yeah, and her dad and even Rye who dropped out of school. So it's there, it's everywhere.
Thank you.
And
You find a way to sprinkle things in. I think, like,
yeah.
I mean, I do think I was actually, I'm in a couple of writing groups, and one of the writing groups, they're online, they're virtual since the pandemic. But one of the writing groups I'm in, the person who leads the writing group, she's amazing. She's a publisher and author, and she has a regular column for Publishers Weekly. So she's like very, very in the know in publishing. But she starts the writing group just for like a few minutes by talking about a different subject. And then we literally just write during the group and then convene at the end. So it's basically like an accountability group. But the other day she talked about something and she used language that I had never thought of before, which I love when people teach you something new. She's writing a memoir, so she was really talking about that experience, but it applies to any book. She said, never lose sight of aboutness. So what is the book about? The one core thing. Now I've written over 40 books and hundreds of essays and articles. I've never used the word aboutness in my life. Yes, Brooke Warner. Yes, she is awesome. But I've never used that word in my life. Like it's never even occurred to me. And obviously I do think about what my books are about, but I never thought about it in that way until she said it. And now I will never unthink it. So to go back to Rula's comment about these different ideas being sprinkled in the book, I do always try with both my fiction and nonfiction that there is like one major narrative. There is one narrative arc. There is one story that's going to be resolved. There is something it's about. There is like, I could sum up in a sentence if I had to what any of my books is about. I don't like only having a sentence, but I can do it. And I think that's what Brooke Warner was talking about with aboutness. But in addition to that, you can sprinkle in these smaller narratives. So whether it's other characters who have full storylines, in some books it is, in this book it wasn't, or it's just ideas that you sprinkle in through the different characters. And I think it's important to do that while maintaining, like, don't get lost in it. Like, for example, that conversation where Dee is talking about Sarah's perspective on academia, I could go on about that forever. If you haven't noticed, I'm a little bit passionate about the academic system, and I mean, look, there are some issues with it, and it is very exclusionary. And there's one conference that I haven't been since the pandemic, but I used to go to every year, and maybe in the future I'll go again. It was my favorite conference, smaller, about 1,500 people, I'd say, 1,200, 1,500. Loved it. But I know that there are a lot of people that don't like that conference because they feel like there's this like insular system there where you're in this like popular group of academics or you're not in it. And I absolutely see that. I know what they're talking about, and I see how that would make it feel like a very different experience. And I'm friends with some of those people that they think are in that group. And so that's not been my experience, but I do see it. And I do think it's a problem. And I do think that the experience, like half the people have at that conference, is very different than like the other half who are just feeling inside or outside. And I'm not saying that that is necessarily true in reality of how they feel. I mean, sometimes it's just you see friends once a year at a conference, so you sit with them for coffee and you go for drinks, and it doesn't mean others aren't welcome. But I understand how it can feel that way. And I understand how it can feel that way when those people who are in our group are people who have gotten recognition in their fields and are deemed successful by others, or they are people that seem aspirational. So I could have gone on and on for a long time in this book about this academic thing, but I didn't. What I read to you is the totality of how that comes up in this book, at least in that way, at least from that character. It's the totality of it. And the reason is because it's good to sprinkle in different ideas, and there are different ways of doing it in your book. but it's also really important to keep your eye on what is the main narrative, and you're not getting sidetracked, and you're not writing things in a disproportionate way, and you're not losing focus. So I try to do that. And now, because of this new word I learned, aboutness, I will think about it differently.
Mhm.
But I've always tried to do that, where, at the end of the day, like this book, at the end of the day, it's meant to be a love story. It's meant to be a love story between a Hollywood star and a woman who at first glance appears just like an ordinary average woman. That's what it's meant to be. And it's meant to be about the search for love and magic in our lives. And so at the end of the day, everything really has to serve that. And any little detours can't take you too far off of that road, I think.
Mhm. Oh, thank you so much for sharing this, Patricia. I mean, we could go on and on. There's just so much to talk about from Hollyland. And we do have some more time. We have around 15 minutes of questions before we spin the wheel and see who our winner of the day or evening is going to be. So,
Your
if
questions
anybody,
they can be about this book, but they can be about writing more generally.
yes, yeah,
If you want to have
absolutely.
comments or discussion about or academia, since we went off on that tangent. But we can have discussion about whatever people would like to have discussion about.
Yes, of course. So, I'll set it here on gallery view so that we could all see each other. Okay. And any questions that you have, feel free now. You could raise your hand on camera because now we can see you. Everybody's on the same page since we don't have a pinned speaker. So would anybody like to comment or ask? I'll check here. You could also use the chat box if you want. Oh, yes, Jules. Hi, could I ask Patricia if she ever slips into academic language while writing novels?
It's a really good question. I don't think that I do. I hope that I don't. I don't think that I do. But I will say that I often have at least one character in a novel who is in academic or something close to that. So is in some way a scholar. In my next novel coming out, The Location Shoot, one of the characters is a philosopher. She's not an academic, she just writes philosophy books, but I usually have a character who will speak in that voice to some extent. So maybe it's not intentional. Maybe that's my subconscious trick for dealing with that. I don't do that on purpose, but maybe it is that way. I feel that writing fiction and writing nonfiction for me are very distinct.
Mhm.
Now that doesn't mean I feel fiction and nonfiction are very distinct. I think there's a slippery slope, and I think that, all fiction is inspired by things that are also real. And so I think those relationships are complicated, but in terms of a writing process and how I write, for me, it feels very different. So for example, when I'm writing a nonfiction book, I always have an extremely detailed outline. Very detailed. That outline can at times take months to write, even if the book takes less, which it usually doesn't. It usually takes a year or two, but it can take less. But sometimes the outline will literally take longer than the book because it's that detailed. So for me, an outline for a book, it's a table of contents with every subheading in every chapter and the content of what is going to be under each subheading. So like, what's the idea? What are the examples? What is the literature I'm going to cite? So there is a ton of work that goes in before the writing. Before I do any of the writing, I have done a literature review. It might not be complete because I might not know everything I'm going to need to search for. So that might be ongoing, but I've done a lit review. I have made this very, very detailed table of contents. By the time I get to writing, it's literally like punching it in a sense, because I have done so much preparatory work. And for me, that's the only way I can conceive of writing nonfiction books, because I just feel they would be overwhelming otherwise. If I look at even any of my own nonfiction books, if I thought about them from beginning to end, like as something I have to do, I think I would have a full-on panic attack. And I truly mean that. And I still feel that way every book, like every single book, over 40 books. I think I would have a full and complete panic attack because it would seem completely unmanageable to me. So the way that I don't think that way is that I look at it as I just have to write this little section. Then I just have to write that little section. Then I just have to, and the way I'm able to do that is because I've done the work of making this very detailed outline and table of contents. And so that is how I write my nonfiction books. So they're very planned in advance and very thought about. Whereas my fiction, it usually isn't that way at all. And it's been different with each novel, but I usually get some idea, some inspiration. It could be like I hear a word, or it could be I watch a movie and I get an idea. It could be that a character appears to me in my mind and I want to sort of figure out what their story is. It happens in different ways. And it happens because I write all the time. I just want to say, you don't sit around like waiting for inspiration. You plug away every day. And when you do that, you get a lot of doses of inspiration. That's the order it actually happens in. But so the novels come to me in these different ways. And I never start writing until I can like mentally see the whole thing in my mind, like a movie, like literally like a movie unfolding over the course of like 2 minutes in my mind's eye. So like I see the beginning, I see the major, whatever the arc is going to be. I see the ending. I usually know the last words. I never know the first words, like literally never, but I always know the last words so I can write my way to them. First words are a lot harder for me. So I know like the story and I know the characters. And I know I'm ready to start writing when I lie awake in bed that night and I can't get them out of my head. That's when I know I'm ready for the next day. Now, sometimes I get an idea and I start writing the next day. I was up all that night and that's when I'm ready. Sometimes I get an idea and I write the book 2 or 3 years later. So like my novel Spark, which came out in 2019, which I'm not going to get into it right now, but I had the inspiration for that novel years earlier, a very specific place I went to in Austria, an experience I had in Austria. I wrote a rough outline, like literally just one page with the characters' names, my idea for the book, and I stuck it in a drawer. And while I did other things, I stewed on it for a couple of years, and then I wrote it. So when I say, when it's fully baked, I'm like awake at night, thinking about the characters, watching a scene play out. It doesn't have to be the whole book, but like I know the whole story and I'm seeing something play out. That's when I know for me that I'm ready to start writing that. So I start writing it the next day. I don't write my novels in order. I write them as scenes. I never know how many chapters there'll be. So I usually just literally label them things like restaurant scene, bar scene, cake scene, wedding scene. I know where they fit in the overall story, but I just don't know necessarily how many chapters and how many scenes it will take me to construct that. And then at some point when I have most of it, or sometimes not till the end, I just stitch them all together. And then I see like, is it a book? Is it a whole book? Like, is it right? And of course I revise dozens and dozens and dozens of times, both every scene as I'm writing dozens of times, the books as a whole. But it's a very different process for me as a writer. And so because it's a different process, I think I am just immediately in a different voice. So to answer what the original question is, I don't think I slip into my academic voice when I'm writing fiction because I think I'm in a different mindset. And so, I really, really mentally experience what the characters experience. Like whatever my protagonist experiences, I do. So, and I've been that way for every novel I've written. So, whatever they're experiencing, like I feel those emotions and I feel it. And because I feel it, it becomes much more of a visceral experience. So like writing academic work is much less visceral. It's much more intellectual experience for me. Like I don't feel emotional. Like I didn't feel emotional when I was writing Method Meets Art. I loved writing that book and I was super interested in the topic and actually loved that I was learning about what all these other people were doing, but I didn't feel emotional. But when I'm writing any of my novels, I feel whatever emotion they feel, which it just puts you in a different headspace. So I don't find that there's slippage. I don't work on fiction and nonfiction in the same day usually. I often, not always, but I will be working on a nonfiction book and a fiction book at the same period of my life, like during the same time, during the same few months or year or whatever it might be. But I go back and forth. So I might work on a novel for a week or 2 weeks, and then I might need a break. So I might go to a nonfiction project. In the case of Hollyland, and the book that followed, the location shoot, I was only writing those books. I was just writing them straight because it was the lockdown and they were just escape for me. I didn't really know what was going to happen. I mean, I didn't know if I'd ever show Hollyland to anyone other than my father. But I loved the book so much in the end that I decided, I definitely wanted to share it. But at the time I was writing it, I didn't know that. And that's been the case with some other things too. And I'll just share one more thing about that sort of writing process in case it's helpful for others who might be writing. So the location shoot, which I also wrote during the lockdown, and actually it comes out in October. I think this is my favorite thing I've ever written. It's my husband's favorite of all my books. I actually think it's mine too. But I never thought we'd agree because we do not have the same taste, but I think it's my favorite book too. And just to tell you briefly about it, the idea was completely inspired, I think, probably by the pandemic. But there's a group that is going to make a film that's shooting in Sweden for 3 months. And it's a very controversial, cinematic, truly artistic French filmmaker who is making this English language film. And he has curated an unexpected cast, which is something that he's known for doing. And they're going to spend 3 months. And the film is about the meaning of life, which was absolutely because it was the pandemic and we were all experiencing existential doom. And so I thought, gee, it would be fun to write a novel about like a group making a film about the meaning of life. And so I show all of the actors in their own life a day before they go to the shoot, and each one is at a major crossroads. Then they spend 3 months together. And the subject of the film, there's like a whole life imitating art theme, and also these deep bonds that they form. Like really, the friendships in this book are my favorite friendships in any of my books. I just think they're beautiful friendships. And it is a romance. It's a love story. The filmmaker invites his friend Ella, who is an American philosopher, and she's known for writing very provocative things about sex and related topics. He invites her to just sort of tag along and spend the summer in Sweden with them. And the star of the film falls in love with her, and it becomes a love story. But this group, they bond in a very, very deep way, and they are living in isolation as they bond in this deep way in like rural Sweden. And then at the end of the 3 months, they each go back to their own lives, and you see them each in their own lives, like addressing the crossroads they had been at. And then they get back together 7 months later at the Cannes Film Festival for the movie's premiere. And you find out what happened to each of them and the impact of their summer together. Okay, that's not why I'm telling you that, although I did definitely want to tell you about this book because I love this book a lot. But when I wrote this book during the pandemic. I wrote it scene by scene, out of order, like I often do. And when I had a full draft, took me about 4 weeks, because I was doing nothing but writing. So when I had a full draft, I read the book and it like worked, but I was like, it's missing a couple things. It's like, it's not missing big things, like the narrative is there, but I was like, I feel like it's missing a couple things. And one of my goals as a writer has always been that there should never be a wasted word. It's just my personal thing. I can't explain it. I have very few things I feel strongly about just for my own art, but that is one of them. And I read a lot of long and rambling books that I enjoy as a reader, but just for what I like to create. So most of my novels are short for novels. Like I like that every word matters and that it's there for a reason. So it's not like I won't just add scenes to like add them, ever, but I felt like something's missing. So I went back and I ended up adding 2 scenes, that I now believe were really important to add. So I'm not gonna, if we do a book club about this book after people have read it, I'll share what the 2 added scenes were so you can decide for yourself if they were, I feel that they were important. But this is the amazing thing. Well, I haven't told anyone this, so, well, I guess it's being recorded, so now I'm telling everyone, but that was not my intention. But I loved writing this book so much, and it really is my favorite one. that I did not want to leave the character. So after the lockdown ended and we were back to more normal life, I decided to continue on with the characters, and I wrote 2 more books following the
Oh,
characters. The next one comes out next September, and the one after that comes out the following October. But the one that comes out, the second book, literally picks up on the last day of this book. And this book is a complete narrative. So nobody's going to read this and think there's another book. In fact, like people, my friends who read it when I first wrote it, my father, they were like, how do you even get a sequel? Like it's all tied up. I'm like, you'll see. I had another idea. So the next book starts the day after this ends. And then the third book is 30 years later. It's 30 years after this book. And the reason I'm saying all of this is because those 2 scenes I added that were not initially in my idea for the month I was writing this first draft, those 2 scenes are what enabled me to add books 2 and book 3. And without those 2 scenes, those other 2 books, which I have already written and that I love, would not exist. So sometimes when you're writing creatively, I think writing anything, but when you're writing creatively or making any kind of art, it's really great to have some kind of plan and to be able to see it and try and create your vision. And it's also really, really important to be open to modifying that and changing it and being flexible and seeing where there might be a space for something else, whether that's removing something, even though you worked hard on it and are proud of it, but it doesn't quite fit, or it's adding something you hadn't thought of. And in this case, literally the 2 scenes that I added, and I spent some time thinking about it. Like when I realized a couple of things were missing, it wasn't like poof, I had the answer. I had to invest like the discipline of really like mulling it over and thinking about it and trying things out, and then realizing what those 2 scenes should be. But as a result of that, those 2 scenes, 100%, which anyone who reads all the books will see, led to those other books. So sometimes I think that the muses do us a favor too, by, things aren't quite perfect. We know things need work, something's nagging at us. And if we follow that, then they will lead us to some new inspiration.
Oh, wow. I mean, thank you so much for letting us know about this. We're really looking forward to reading the location shoot and the 2 sequels that follow.
Thank you.
Um, I would say, I mean, I loved all the characters in Hollyland, but if I would like to see somebody again, it would be Troy. Troy is so funny, and he is such a dynamic character, and just, he belongs in, I think, every novel you could think of. He's
I
just so
love
funny. He's a
Troy.
little comic relief.
He's for those of you who haven't read the book yet, Troy is one of Dee's 2 best friends. And so I gave her Sarah, who's this sort of like, she's academic, she's reserved, a little bit uptight maybe. And Troy, who is an artist, he's a comic book artist, and he's like completely fun and comedic, and he's encouraging her to go and have sex with a movie star, and he's light. So like one's heavier, one's lighter. And he's sort of like all heart and Sarah's like very brainy. And so there's this contrast. So he was enormously fun to write, obviously, even though he's a
Mhm.
small character. But I will tell you, Rula, I did not realize this until you just said it. I loved writing him so much because somebody who says like quippy, like funny, like sex things and is sarcastic is fun to write. Those people are fun. They're fun in life. They're fun to write.
Mhm.
He's not in another book, but I did feel after I wrote the book, I was like, gee, like I'm gonna miss writing him. Like he was so much fun. The next book I wrote was the location shoot. The main character of the location shoot, Ella, who is this philosopher who comes to join them, she writes very provocative, very quippy sorts of books about sex and related topics. And she has a great sense of humor. I mean, she is madly, madly funny. And Jean, the filmmaker, he's this like very stoic, dystopian, sort of like ultra serious filmmaker. And the banter between the 2 of them was beyond fun to write. And I now realize that a seed for Ella was Troy's personality and his banter and his
Um,
wittiness. And that the very next book I wrote was this book. And that because I enjoyed that so much, I took it and I put it into like protagonist form where I could write it more. And I literally did not realize that until you just said it. So thank
Well,
you,
there
which
you
also
go.
goes to show you how inspiration works and how people reflect ideas
Mhm.
onto one another, and how we often do things that we aren't even aware of when we're working creatively. There have
Mhm.
been many of my books I've been surprised about when I've read later on, like, gee, I didn't realize it was about this. Like, I thought it was about this. I didn't know it was also about that. Like, I think that's the thing that as artists that we experience. And I think that's amazing when you discover something in your own work that you did not know was there.
Mhm. And it takes you places. That's
Yeah,
amazing.
absolutely.
And we hope to see Hollyland as a movie. I mean, I could easily see it as a
From your
movie.
lips. It's so funny. My husband read it, he was the first person. Well, the second. I actually sent it to my father first. He was the second person who read it, and he said, "Yeah, this would make a really good movie." And I'm like, "Well, you try to find someone in Hollywood who's interested." So then he made his usual joke that he thinks Hollywood is obsessed with itself and that they love to make
Mhm.
movies about themselves and honor those movies. So his feeling is like, if any of your books has a shot, that's the one. So,
Oh, it's,
well,
I mean, absolutely. I could see it as a movie.
thank
It's
you.
wonderful. There's so much to see in it, and I think it would do great as a
Thank
film.
you. From your lips. We'll see
And
what happens.
well, fingers crossed. Let's see. I'm sorry, Andrea. I just realized that you had a question popped up in the chat box too. We have a maelstrom exploding into the public space, the celebrity space regarding Russell Brand. Are you tempted to take on toxic celebrity, duplicity, etc., and its psychic and violent manifestations?
Okay, so I don't know what happened with Russell Brand just now. So you will have to fill me in on that. But I'll get to like now because I want to know. But I'll get to the question first. Yes, I mean it is. I'm interested. Okay, so I'm doing this. This is going to sound like a tangent, but I promise it's 100% on point with this question. I have a very weird project I'm doing right now. There is this lovely literary arts and culture magazine that is devoting their 2024 special issue to celebrating my work, which is obviously really, really lovely. And then we have an academic journal in 2025 that's putting out an expanded issue of it. So obviously, when I say it's a weird project, it's a very weird project to sit and write about your own work. And it just is. So we have lovely contributors and it's very weird for other people to be writing about your work. I think for any normal person, it's just unusual. So I call it a strange project, although it's a lovely project, and the contributors have been enormously generous and amazing, as has the editor, both editors. But in any event, contributors have signed on, but I am also I'm writing an opening editorial, and then I'm writing two concluding pieces. And to write these, I had to spend a lot of time like, what am I going to say? Like, how do you talk about your whole body of work? Like, how do you talk about what your work means to you or what it might mean to someone else? You can't talk about everything. I mean, I've written over 40 books. I couldn't even talk about all those. 10 book series, a journal, hundreds of essays. Like, what do you even choose to talk about? What do you like? I'm sure I've made this bigger in my mind, but I spent months while other contributors were actually writing their pieces. I spent months like figuring out what am I going to write about? Um, and I thought, how can I really distill? Because my work looks like lots of different things to most people, and I recognize that. But to me, it all makes sense together. I'm like, how can I distill this for people? And so I've distilled it in this way that with all my work, my entire body of work, what I'm really trying to do is two things: create a philosophy of the arts and a philosophy of love in all my books since the beginning, and in my other works that support my books. Those are the two overarching goals. And these days I'm choosing to do those primarily through fiction, but I've done it in my nonfiction for my entire career as well. So when I think about my novels, like obviously when you're writing one, you're thinking about just that one. You want to make that book. I always want to make every book as good as it can be. I want to make it a book that I want to read. So you're thinking about just that story and just that story about the arts that I'm telling in that book. And every one of my novels from my debut Low Fat Love to now, there's over a dozen published, and there's like 8 more that are written that haven't come out yet. So it's a lot. They all have a narrative about the arts. It's all different. Each narrative is completely different. So when you look at them individually, you just see one story about the arts. If you chose to look at them as a body of work, which I'm doing for this strange experiment of writing about my own work, if you choose to look at them as a body of work, what you see is that there's an entire philosophy of the arts that is created throughout these books. And so to answer the question, I have taken on different aspects of pop culture, celebrity culture, commercial culture, all those sorts of things, including the toxic side of it, in different books. So in my debut novel, Low Fat Love, the characters are constantly consuming pop culture, including the opening scene is a scene of the protagonist consuming a tabloid news story about Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt. So it's literally constantly throughout the book, and it's all negative. It's all that these characters are consuming this, and it is having a negative effect on their self-concept, their sense of self. It's throughout the entire book. 2 books later, my book Blue, my novel Blue, I decided to make, like, in my mind, like a sister book to Low Fat Love. It's not a sequel or anything, but it was going to be the opposite. And it was going to be how people consume pop culture and entertainment and art and use it in positive ways to construct their identities. Which incidentally, I think we all use pop culture, art, and entertainment in different ways to construct our own identities, to make sense of who we are. And I think those ways are positive and negative. I don't think they're exclusively one or the other. I think you can't even discern all the ways that you use these things, that we all use these things as mirrors and benchmarks, and that they give us ideas of what our relationship looks like, or what beauty is, or just many, many different things, what success looks like. I think we use them in lots of different ways, and some people might use them more. They might gear more toward negative or positive in terms of what they choose to consume, how they self-actualize, but I think in different ways. And so I have, throughout my career, tried to incorporate that into fiction. And it is interesting because in Hollyland, the main characters, they're all positive figures. And so it is this positive model of what celebrity can be. But there is this negative, toxic stuff lurking. So there is paparazzi lurking. They are, in a negative way lurking. There are jokes and comments about that are very much sort of tabloid comments that come out, including about Rye's mother, that continue to come out throughout the book, who was murdered. And then in the location shoot, the next book, it's another case where I try to make the characters positive, but none of them are solely positive. Not in the same way Hollyland is. Hollyland was like a love letter to my dad, so I decided it was going to be one thing. So location shoot, the characters are a little more complicated. So like one of the characters, he has redeeming qualities, but he is also like a little bit sleazy and very into fame and very into like being able to hook up with lots of women because he's famous. He's on like basically a nighttime soap opera, and he very much embodies the character he plays. And he is multidimensional, so I'm not giving away his positive things right now, but I do create those tensions in that book. And that is part of the narrative. One of the actresses in the book, her name is Willow. She's one of my favorites, and like the early readers and trade magazines and stuff like that have read the book so far, people seem to really like her. But she's young, she's in her early 20s, and she is somebody who became famous when she was like a tween. And she basically became like a public train wreck. DUIs, bad relationships, just sort of fell apart at the seams, like exploded with fame and fell apart. She's now been out of the spotlight for years. And she's the most followed person on social media, but she doesn't have any real roles. And her sleazy manager is always trying to get her to take roles where she plays like the prostitute, or like the drug dealer's girlfriend, or, a stripper, and she wants to turn it around, and she doesn't want to be seen as a train wreck, but she doesn't know how. And then out of the blue, she gets cast in this piece of like cinematic art. And she's so terrified because she doesn't even think she's a real actress. And she's just terrified of that. And they have very honest conversations, and she talks to the older actors who have been famous a long time and who have navigated it differently than her, about how she can change her reputation and how she doesn't want to be seen that way and she wants to be taken seriously. And she gets a lot of really good advice from them. But they also make comments about, well, what it's like for girls and women versus men in the entertainment industry, what all of these things are like, and like, what is the flip side to fame? So the characters aren't toxic, but they have conversations about their mistakes and about the toxic side of the industry that they're in. And her character arc in the location shoot, all of the supporting cast, they have a full storyline. So it's not primary. There's a primary love story that is the main story, but you see the full arc for all of those characters. And you find out, I'm not giving anything away, you find out pretty early on that, you know, when she was very young, her mother and her grandmother, who were the people who raised her, both died. And she had to navigate fame by herself. And she was basically just desperate for love. And so she thought fame was love. And so she did a lot of negative, toxic things to try and get more of it. And it ended up taking her down. And then you see the journey she goes on by connecting with these other people and making this film about, what does life mean? What is the meaning of life? What are the big questions in our lives and how do we answer it? So I do try to take these things on in different ways in different books, so that when you put it together, there's this larger overarching narrative. And I have actually thought about and have an idea for a novel that would have a lead character, who is much more toxic. I don't know whether or not I'll write that. I am contracted for a novel right now, which I have an outline for, but I haven't started writing because I'm busy with other things, but like I'm itching to write and dying to write. And I will just say briefly that that novel is going to be a commentary on cancel culture. And it is going to happen with a successful singer, movie star, male, in his 40s, who several years earlier was canceled. And a young reality TV star who is like America's sweetheart right now. And the story that happens between two of them and how you see them both in the beginning is very different than how you see them both at the end when you look at what actually happened. But it will be another way of looking at this sort of toxic side. And my hope is that in that book, readers will start off seeing it one way and then the script will get flipped a little bit. So, but my overall goal, which I hope to have many more books to do that are unplanned and that I don't have ideas for yet. My overall goal is to create this larger philosophy of the arts and to cover sort of a dimension of it in each book. And then this philosophy of love. And when I say love, that is not just romantic love, that is self-love, that is familial love, that is friendship, that is love of art or whatever you do and have passion for in your life, that love of country and patriotism. It can be many, many different things. And those are the two things that I'm trying to do overall. So now you have to tell me what happened with Russell Brand, because I feel like
okay,
I missed
I
something.
made a quick crib. Thank you for the response. Quick crib. He's British-born, Hollywood's bad boy, recovered addict, comedian, turned spiritual guru, left-wing, now right-wing media critic, and with an alleged history of sexual assault and rape, like sexual assault in all its form. He's dangerously charismatic. I live in Canada, but personally, I went to the Roundhouse Theatre in London when he was piloting some new material. And if you open the Guardian or the Telegraph, it's everywhere today. And as I was listening to you, I felt not that you wouldn't have explored toxicity in your canon, but that this material is ripe for exploration. And I'll just add that Elon Musk and Jordan Peterson have, I will editorialize, lamentably been the first to step forward and support him publicly.
Wow. Okay,
wow.
Super interesting. I'll be Googling this as soon as we get off. All I ever knew about him was that he was married to Katy Perry. That's it. That's the extent of what I knew. So I have something to Google. Thank you for that. Inspiration.
Right, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for your comments and questions. And most of all, thank you so much, Patricia, for sharing this lovely sacred space with us.
Thank
We were
you.
able
Thank you
to,
for having me, and thank you for attending. It's so lovely to meet and talk with all of you.
so right now, let me just show you I found this online where we could spin the wheel, and I just spun it right now, and apparently we have a winner who is Andrea. So congratulations, Andrea.
How
Um,
could that be?
so Andrea, you will win. I'll send you a code that you can use for any of our upcoming conferences. So we have three coming up very soon. So you could either choose Science and Sensibility, which is coming up this weekend, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Our keynote speakers are going to be Jack Cooper, a neuroscientist and poet based in London, and Shun Yu, who is also a scientist. And I don't know if you're familiar with her poetry from Site Creative before. And we also have Psyche and Symbol coming up in October. Our keynote speaker isn't confirmed yet, but will be very soon this week. We have the Alchemy Conference at Oxford University coming up in November. And our keynote speakers, we're very lucky to have them join us in person, are Susan Rowland and Lisa Oz. So Lisa has written about transformation in her book, Us. And of course, many of you know her from the Dr. Oz show and many other things in her recipe books. And of course, the You series. And Susan goes without saying, I mean, she's the ultimate scholar on alchemy and Jung and art space research. And of course, our previous book club was about her alchemy, fire, murder mystery. So choose whichever one you'd like. I'll send you the code and you can use it in either one of those. We're having another lucky draw tomorrow, of course, because we have Site Creative tomorrow. Lovely Sarah and I will be co-hosting tomorrow. And our guest speaker is Birgit Hoyer. She'll be talking about trans-binarity and clouds of knowing in the Jungian arts-based research clinic. So there will be a lot of psychology, a lot of arts, and a lot of quantum physics. You're probably familiar with Birgit's work from before, as we had her last year. She also spoke about positive reasoning and quantum physics in the clinic, the psychology clinic. So we'd love to see you all again tomorrow and at our forthcoming conferences as well. Patricia, I cannot thank you enough. This has been hugely enjoyable. I really can't wait until I read the location shoot. I'm going to pre-order my copy as soon as possible and have it read and gulp down. I mean, this took me literally like 2.5 hours to finish. I just couldn't put it down.
Thank you. You are so
Amazing
kind.
read.
You are so kind. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me and for your kind comments. And the book is available for pre-order, everywhere. So anywhere you like to get your books. But I really appreciate this. And I would definitely love to do another chat for the location shoot.
Absolutely. So as soon as it's out, we'll need to book a time that, I mean, or you could tell me, just email me whenever and tell me, you know what, this month, this day, it works for me, and then we'll have it booked.
And one of these days, we're
So,
going to do something in person. I'm jealous that Susan is going to be there in
of
person.
of
One of
course,
these
yes,
days, we're
just
going to
let
make it
us know when
happen.
you're on. We will
Thank you
definitely make
so
it
much for
happen.
this.
So hopefully in 2024, would you be here in London?
2024 is an impossible year for any travel because I'm spending 6 months, 6 weeks in Iceland, 2 weeks in
Okay.
Japan, and I have
Wow.
several other trips, but that's like 8 weeks just that. So I mentally committed that, and my husband's basically said, we cannot be away anymore in 2024. So
Mhm.
2025, see,
All
the problem
right.
is my dance card gets filled like way in advance. Like that, I mean, like literally, because some of these invitations or it just happens so far in advance. So yeah, but this summer I'm actually very excited. I'll be in Iceland for 6 weeks, one of my favorite countries to go to. applied to an artist residency. So I'll be working on a novel, looking at a volcano, and I'm pretty excited
Wow.
about that. And then I'll be in Japan for a couple of weeks talking to different universities about arts-based research and a few other little trips, but it's crazy. So 2025, let's plan something, please.
2025. Then we're waiting for you. Just one more year. We're almost there. We're almost in 2024. So we hope to see you very soon in person. And of course, hopefully we could do something in the States, of course. I also can't make it to
I
the
want
States
to
in
go. Are you
2024
kidding?
again.
I want to go to London. So,
Yeah.
you're welcome to come to the States. I have some lovely guest space. You can even stay with me. It's gorgeous here in
Thank
Maine.
you.
Just don't come in the winter. So, yes to the States, but I want to go to London. So, we have to plan an event in your neck of the
Yes,
woods.
of course. Yeah, absolutely. Um, and yes, we hope this would be very soon. 2025 is right around the corner. And our next Indelible Evenings is going to be with Sandra Faulkner, another wonderful arts-based researcher, and she will be talking about poetry and writing poems about other people's stories. So this will be the next
She's
episode of
amazing.
Indelible Evenings. Yes.
She's amazing. I just want to say she is a person. I discovered her work like over 15 years ago and basically stalked her at a conference. And I was like, I really want to know you. Can we please be friends? Her work is amazing.
Oh,
So
she's
I
amazing.
highly
And she
recommend.
wrote with you in the handbook of arts-based research,
She
didn't she?
did. She
Yeah.
contributed to that. And she's published books in a couple book series I've edited. And
Yeah.
she's really, really amazing with poetic inquiry. So that sounds like a good event. Enjoy.
Thank you. And hopefully we'll have you both in person very soon. So everybody have a wonderful day/evening,
Thank
midday, I
you,
don't know.
Pam. See you
All right.
soon.
So see you all soon. Bye.